Welcome to Our.Love podcast, where we share insights from top scientists and relationship experts on all things about love that are out of the box, refreshing, and new. Now sit back, grab a cold drink or hot one if you prefer, and enjoy today's episode.
So, Leanne Campbell, so great to talk to you about a bunch of things, but I'm particularly interested in getting some help from you understanding the idea of vulnerability in relationships. I just want to, first I want to say, wow, so you got your undergraduate degree at Simon Fraser.
Yes, I did. Yes, West Coast of Canada.
Yeah, it's so beautiful up there.
It's beautiful. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. And then you did your graduate work with Dr. Sue Johnston, whose own graduate work sort of gave us emotionally focused therapy.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So after I did my BA degree on the West Coast of Canada, I traveled across the country, midway across the country, to the University of Ottawa, where I was able to work with Sue and all kinds of other wonderful professors and really immerse myself in the world of clinical psychology. And unusually so for a clinical psychologist, I think, statistics.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I love about your biography. You've got this background in statistics and research methodology, and really teaching that stuff for quite a while, in addition to working closely with a therapy that really emphasizes emotional connection. It's not the sort of combo that you often see, although you might agree or disagree. I think that statisticians get painted with a too broad a brush.
Yeah. Yes. Well, I had an amazing professor at the University of Ottawa, Barbara Byrne, who really knew how to make statistics accessible. So I took every single statistics course that I could, and I did a big study for my PhD with factor analysis and structural equation modeling, which is probably...
Lord.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, man. And what was it like working with Sue in those years?
Oh, my goodness. Amazing. You know Sue. You've worked with Sue. So charismatic. We would line up. The hallway would be packed with people waiting for her supervision on the 6th floor of the Vanier building. And we would share our cases. And I was lucky enough to be a therapist in some of those early studies when we were using those little baby cassette tapes. And she was coding everything, and her students were coding everything. Yeah, it was unbelievable.
Classic studies.
Yes.
Well, can I just launch right into asking you some questions about vulnerability? Because obviously it's one of the things that we really want to cover today, but also it's been a particular fascination of mine during the pandemic.
Right.
Because, there's been lots of questions for me about how to achieve it in a context where there's social distancing and et cetera. But I think for our listeners, what we really need to do first off is just figure out what vulnerability is. What do we mean by vulnerability?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great question. Well, I think historically, the word vulnerability has had a bit of a bad rap, been associated with helplessness and powerlessness and all kinds of negative connotations. But in our world, in the world of EFT in particular, but social relations more generally, vulnerability is really about being tuned into ourselves, being real, being authentic, being able to look in, not look out, and really getting to know ourselves and in ways that allow us to grow and become more of who we can be. So
would you say then that, yeah, I mean, those all sound like big deals to me, like, sort of the life well lived. But I wonder if there are some sort of similar ideas that overlap here, like authenticity. um, honesty, truth.
Mhm.
Do you think that vulnerability involves putting yourself at risk?
Yes, absolutely. So those old terms are not, they're not inaccurate. It is true that when we put ourselves at risk, we sometimes are in places of helplessness. Yeah, it does. And if we think about social relations, and certainly the world that I've lived in around therapy and couple therapy in particular, it really is about helping people to take risks in relationships that allows them to grow personally and relationally and become more of who they can be in their most important relationships.
Yeah, but why not help people to be, more individually resilient, more sort of, stronger? What is this going to do for them to try and to sort of reveal themselves as having weaknesses or needs that might not be met or desires that might make them feel ridiculous, for example? I mean, that sounds scary to me.
Right. Yes. Well, indeed, Dr. Cohn, you better than me know that we are wired for connection and we do a lot better together than separate. But, it's of course also the case that many of us have either lived in contexts that are unsafe or grown up in contexts that are unsafe, or then maybe there's an intergenerational pattern of a lack of safety in relationships. And we know based on attachment science that there's a finite number of ways to cope with a lack of safety in our social worlds. We either tend to shut down, numb out, lash out, or some combination of both. For those of us who have been lucky enough to grow up in safe worlds and live in safe worlds, it's much easier for us to move with and through emotion, to tune into our vulnerabilities, to know ourselves, to share ourselves, and to risk being connected.
And yet, because of those experiences that some of us have had growing up in unsafe conditions, we've learned on the one hand that we need to be more self-sufficient, and that can mean less authentic, right? That can mean, managing, cultivating or designing a self to project to the world that may be very different from the self that's inside. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, we might be encouraged to do that because that's really what we need to do.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So what changes when we try to have an intimate relationship?
Yeah. Well, I think it really is all about safety and it's about boundaries as well. So there are times when it's best for us, it's most adaptive for us to put a certain to put forward a certain self to the world in specific kinds of relationships or contexts such as business potentially. But in our intimate relationships, in the relationships that matter most to us, in the relationships where we can tune into ourselves with the understanding that our partner will be accessible, responsive, and engaged, will be there for us. It's much better for us to risk. It's much better for us to risk being all that we can be in those relationships in a way that allows us to grow and allows us to take risks in these other contexts like business and education and all kinds of other areas of our lives, knowing that we have a safe place to fall, knowing that we have someone to turn to if things don't go so well.
I mean, I believe you, but I'm feeling maybe I'm a little bit afraid myself. So I'm feeling like, how does one move into a relationship and start feeling safe enough to be vulnerable?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's two-sided, really.
Uh-oh. Oh, man.
Yes.
Now it's complicated. It's two-sided. It's not just something I can do.
No, it's something that you do together. Absolutely.
Oh, great.
For sure. Yeah.
That figures. So if I'm going to risk being vulnerable with my partner, first of all, I'm still not totally sure I understand why that's a good thing, why I shouldn't just, bring my best self to it. Because being vulnerable maybe means showing my partner something that's embarrassing because it's like most people would agree it's not that great, you know? So that's one problem. So, I still don't know whether I can do that, but now I have to depend on my partner somehow to help me do that. How does that happen?
Well, okay. So the thing you're asking is if I reveal myself to my partner, I mean, that is the $1,000,000 existential question, right? If I reveal myself to you, will you love me? Will you respect me? Will you reject me?
Yeah.
That's what makes it scary. That's what people are afraid of course. But what I've seen over and over and over again in my therapy world for the past 3 decades is that it's the exact opposite. It ironically so. The more that we share our flaws and our insecurities and our uncertainties, the more our partners love us, the more that they support us, and the more that we can risk being all that we can be. But it is, it's a leap of faith for sure.
It's a leap of faith. It's a leap of faith. And maybe help us understand what it looks like to be vulnerable.
Right.
How does it, I can imagine, for example, say, I grew up in an unsafe environment, let's say. I'm desperately afraid, or let's just say I'm an average North American male, and I'm deathly afraid of female anger, as many are. This is one of the things I found with John Gottman, is that female anger is just, many men would rather be boiled alive. And there's something I want to say about something I'm hurt about, but I'm desperately afraid that you're going to get angry with me. So I just don't say it. And I grimly march along through our relationship for, 5 years, just feeling this. What if I say it and you get angry at me?
Mm-hmm.
My worst fear realized.
Well, part of vulnerability is really tuning into ourselves and being curious about what it is about my partner's anger that makes it scary, that makes me want to recoil and withdraw and not not risk that. Is it about me feeling like I'm not good enough? Or is it me feeling rejected? Or is it me, whatever the case may be? And if I actually tuned into myself and was curious about that and actually identified what it is that makes that so frightening, if I imagined myself sharing that with my partner, then maybe I could risk actually disclosing it.
So you can imagine it, but you added something that's fascinating to me, which is not just taking the risk of being vulnerable, but also taking the mindset of curiosity about not only my own vulnerability and the thing I'm vulnerable about, but about the situation that unfolds when I express my vulnerability. In a sense, this is like testing what happens when I'm vulnerable. It reminds me of an old Albert Ellis, of all people, story where he's first developing his rational emotive therapy. And he says, I was too afraid to ask anyone out on a date. So I just started going out and asking them, and I didn't catch on fire like I thought I would.
Nice. Exactly.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
So one thing that might happen is you express your vulnerability, your partner gets angry, and then you're still sitting there, not bursting in flames. And now you have some grist for your mill to work on with each other.
Exactly.
Especially if you're lucky enough to be sitting there with Leanne Campbell.
Right. Yeah, exactly. It's always much easier when you have a third party in the room who can help manage the conversation.
Right. Because when you're being vulnerable and emotions are heightened, I don't know if you realize this, but blood is literally going to leave your this is the international symbol for blood leaving your prefrontal cortex.
Right. Exactly.
Blood is going to start leaving your prefrontal cortex, and you're not going to be able to think. So in a sense, I've told Sue this before too. You, Leanne, are this hypothetical couple. I think we're going to continue with this therapy session. This hypothetical couple where he's trying to express something he's upset about, and he's worried about her anger. They're both emotional, so they can't use their prefrontal cortex. So you are their surrogate prefrontal cortex. You're going to carry that burden for a little while. It's a beautiful thing. But can we flip it around a little bit? Now I'm the wife.
Okay.
I don't know why I did that.
Excellent.
Now I'm the wife. I don't look like it, but I'm angry. He just said something that was really scary for him to say, and he was right. Pissed me off. But I've been talking with Leanne, and I'm thinking, okay, vulnerability is what we want. What do I do? How do you teach someone to respond to vulnerability?
Mm-hmm. Well, I would ask you, what happened in the split second before you got angry? What happened when your partner turned to you with those water-filled eyes and shared with you his fear? What happened in that split second? Just in that moment, what happened inside of you in that moment? So I would help you to tune into the vulnerable part of you. And when we can help our partners meet each other at that level, everything changes. The world changes in that moment. But yeah, that's right. At the outset, when these patterns are well entrenched, it's a millisecond before we go back to anger.
This is so fascinating because what you're saying is you're not giving me as the receiving spouse some kind of manual for the right way to receive a vulnerable message. You're basically asking me to be vulnerable too.
Exactly.
Holy crap.
Why it's two-sided. Exactly. That's right.
And so we both start becoming vulnerable with each other.
Yeah.
It's a good thing you're in the room, because that sounds like some pretty scary business. A lot of emotion could be happening.
Yes, at times. But vulnerability, I mean, maybe we can even think about it on a continuum in terms of how it's expressed. It can be very quiet. Initially, it could just be about making eye contact, about, tuning into one another across from each other at the dinner table. Or, yeah.
What does that mean, tuning into each other?
I think being present with ourselves and with our partners in a way that allows us to know ourselves and know our partners. Really, that's what vulnerability is all about. And that's why vulnerability is the fertile ground for growth. It's when we tune into our partners, we see ourselves through their eyes and we get to know ourselves better.
Oh my God, that sounds terrifying. What you reminded me of, sorry, I'm not saying at all the right things. I'm saying all the wrong things. But here's what's true. You have children?
Yes, I do.
So you have had yourself reflected to you
That's right.
from the way that your children respond.
Absolutely.
And sometimes, not saying all the time, maybe more for some of us than others, sometimes that's a little disturbing because you see yourself in a way that is not so flattering, right?
Yes.
But that it strikes me that that must be part of vulnerability too, right?
Yes.
If we're taking vulnerability seriously, do we have to learn, in a sense, I don't want to be too flowery about this, but to love ourselves despite being, being revealing or discerning, maybe for the first time in the context of our relationship, some qualities that we're really ashamed of.
Yeah. And maybe it's really about accepting our humanity, that we all have insecurities, flaws, uncertainties, places where we get stuck, feel stuck.
Yeah. I mean, I think you've just actually touched on a huge part of the value of being vulnerable, right? Is that with practice, being vulnerable, you can actually start accepting your own humanity.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And the more that we can see ourselves, the easier it is to have empathy for others.
The more we can see ourselves, the easier it is to have empathy for others. I'm going to put that on a t-shirt.
Yes.
I'll quote you. What happens to a relationship that struggles too much with being vulnerable, or they can't be vulnerable with each other? What happens to that relationship?
Well, so I was saying earlier that we know, based on attachment science, that there's a finite number of ways that we manage threat. We either lash out, we numb out, or we do some combination of both, or potentially we move with and through emotion. We tune into our vulnerabilities. So in relationships that are distressed, one or both partners are either numbing out, lashing out, or some combination of both. And sometimes that has a history in the relationship, as well as a history that predates the relationship. And that makes it hard to connect. It makes it hard. The great attachment scientist, John Bowlby, tells us that lost my train of thinking there. Tells us
you
that.
Numb out.
Say it again. What's that?
You numb out. You
numb out, you lash out, or you do some combination of both. And in the context of couple relationships and distressed relationships, we're seeing that. And a common pattern that you're aware of, based on Gottman's research, and certainly Sue Johnson's research has shown the same, is that oftentimes there's one partner in the relationship that tends to withdraw. And then the more that partner withdraws, the more that the other partner, the angry woman that you described earlier, is a common theme that we see, tends to get angry. And the way that this partner begins to reach to the other leaves the other person feeling not good enough, not measuring up, not okay in the relationship. And the more that person feels not okay, the more that person wants to shrink and withdraw and retreat even further, and more distance ensues in the relationship. And oftentimes, by the time they come to see us, not so much now as in earlier years, because I think there's a lot more education and information out in the world, those patterns are well entrenched. And those partners really aren't even looking at each other. They don't make eye contact. They don't share. The vulnerability is very much absent in the relationship. There is no safety.
There's no safety. And so it seems to me that vulnerability and safety are two sides of the same coin.
Yes, definitely.
Wow. So if we're going to choose to be vulnerable with each other, there's a sense in which we have to choose to be safe with each other.
Yes.
And would you say that that's maybe the real hurdle here?
Yes. And I think the example that we spoke about earlier illustrates it well, that at the beginning, I mean, it's like anything. We don't feel safe. We take a leap of faith by risking a tiny bit at a time. So initially, it might be, as I described earlier, that this person, this angry woman that you described, tunes in to what she's feeling in the moment when her partner makes contact in a different way from a place of vulnerability. And that begins to challenge her template for a lack of safety and a lack of and feeling alone in the relationship.
It is fascinating to me to watch you guys do this therapy. I've seen multiple iterations of this over the years from your training tapes and things.
Right.
And one of the things that the experimentalist in me is always just completely blown away by is when you are talking in the early stages of therapy, when you're working with a partner who's having a hard time expressing vulnerability, and you have them talking to you, Leanne,
Yes,
right?
that's right.
About the vulnerable thing while the partner listens. And then you do this magic trick. I don't know how else to put it because I'm not an EFT therapist, right? You do this magic trick where you say, okay, now turn and face your partner and just tell her what you told me. I want you to help me understand this because for those who've never seen this or have never been through EFT before, and I highly recommend it, what happens is very often while the partner A is talking with Leanne, the other partner B is just sitting there quietly listening. Then Leanne says, can you turn and face your partner and say the same thing that you just said? The information has not changed. There's nothing that's changed about the information. But when partner A is now talking to partner B, suddenly there's tears and emotion and just this outpouring. That's like some kind of thunderclap of psychological substance is happening in the room. You, Leanne, have created for them a moment of intimacy through the medium of vulnerability and safety that they haven't maybe experienced much or maybe ever.
Yes.
And the result is absolutely incredible.
Yeah, it is. It's amazing. And yeah, it's an incredible privilege to witness it. And yeah, you described it well. And then we help them to understand that they in fact created it. And we help them to understand how they did it so that they can begin to generalize these baby gains, these tiny gains between sessions and over the course of therapy. And yes, people can absolutely learn to do this. People can learn to be vulnerable in their most important relationships. And when there's energy in the relationship, which you know from the Gottman research, then that happens quite readily. That people really do. You know, when I have the partner turn to the other, it's with the knowing that that person has an investment in the relationship, and that's what makes the magic.
Interesting. But there's also something about turning them to face each other.
Yes,
there's something in this moment of vulnerability that's not just about the content of what is being said. It's about You know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of my cats. And I'll tell you what I mean, because that's kind of silly.
Okay.
My cat loves to be scratched on the most vulnerable part of his body, right here under his neck. And when cats are really feeling lovey and safe, they roll on their back and expose their neck, and you scratch their neck. Why do they like that so much? Well, people like Steve Porges and others have looked into how animals communicate ritualistically, and these are little rituals, right? Little rituals that mammals have for showing someone else that I am happy to be vulnerable with you. I'm sticking my neck out, and so I maybe wonder when you have the partner turn to the other and say the words that they just got finished speaking, they're doing something else. They're sticking their neck out a little bit. And so vulnerability seems to me not just to be a risk, but also a kind of offering, a kind of gift to your partner. That when you're vulnerable with your partner, you're sending a different kind of message than when you're not vulnerable. You're saying, I trust you. Does that seem right?
Yes. And I think you're also saying you matter to me. And I
You
love the word
matter to me.
offering. Yeah, I'm giving myself to you because you matter to me. And that's what makes it so scary, because the way that you view me, the way that you respond to me is going to impact the way that I feel about myself.
Oh, wow. So when I gift you my trust and vulnerability, my authentic self, that can change you. That can change how you feel, how you think, in some ways who you are, because you're you're being sort of taught how to regard yourself.
Yes. Yeah.
I'm ready. Let's go. Let's go. Let's do a session. I want to do it. This sounds good.
Yes.
Do you think that being vulnerable is then a skill that you can learn over time with practice?
I want to immediately say yes.
Yeah, but I noticed some hesitation. I hope you don't mind me
Yeah.
saying.
Yes. I think the word skill feels a bit off to me, because I think that vulnerability is not really about building competence. It's about
Competence?
building confidence,
Uh-huh.
and really building the self, expanding ourselves, beginning to know ourselves better, risking and stretching ourselves. It's really much more than skills. It really is about allowing us to grow and be all that we can be. And it's the relationships that matter most to us that support that, that fuel
Wow.
that.
Yeah. During the pandemic, when so many of us had to be socially isolated, one of the questions I got the most from people was, how can we achieve connection without being in the same room together? How can we do that? This Zoom thing doesn't seem to be working out very well. And I'm wondering if that came up for you in your work at all, with clients or with between your clients and couples that you worked with.
Yeah, it's a great question. There's a couple of thoughts. One is that I've been impressed and amazed at how powerful Zoom can be in terms of allowing us to tune in to one another. And especially when we are open and vulnerable, it's incredible to me how much we can transmit across these screens. But where it's really become problematic for our client base is I work a lot with veterans and active military and a lot of people that are quite isolated. And I've had the great pleasure and honor to build a few beautiful clinics on Vancouver Island. And so a big part of what we provide when people come to our offices to see us is this incredible staff and a welcoming environment, and people bring their service dogs and all kinds of things. So people are really missing that aspect of things in terms of the clinical work, and also some of the groups that have been available and that kind of thing. That yes, that I think Zoom doesn't replace some of this. And in the couple context, working on Zoom only works if people are in the same room, because we really do want them to be able to touch each other, to look into each other's eyes with some proximity. And the intensity of the emotion, of course, is to some degree diminished across the screen.
Yeah. Yeah. But I'm glad to hear that you've been doing it, especially with military families. You know, I grew up in a military family, and I know very well that sort of, I mean, I guess the nicest way to put it is that sort of stoic, attitude that allows you to just press on through the pain, whatever it is. It is, not exactly a military value to be vulnerable. So that is a lot to work with, lady. I don't know how you do that.
Yeah, I love it. And again, it's step by step, moment by moment. And, sometimes we see people who have been living in their cars in the woods, very, very isolated, and coming to see us is a huge leap of faith in terms of vulnerability. And I often tell a story about one of the first clients that I ever worked with at the University of Ottawa, who came to see me at the beginning of a 2-year internship. And, what I was starting to say earlier is, Bowlby would talk about our protection becoming our prison. So when we have learned to shut down and to numb out and all of those things, of course, it restricts our capacity to connect and to grow in connection. And so I was a new graduate student, just starting my internship. And if you kind of can imagine what this would have been like for this man, we'll call him Brad. That wasn't his name, of course. He imagine what it took for him to travel on a bus, a city bus, across the city, walk up the stairs of the Vanier building to the university, a busy place, as you know, lots of people milling about, the poutine truck stop. And then he'd have to get into the elevator up the 6th floor to where the clinic was, just down from Sue Johnson's office. And when I met him, he was wearing a sports coat and a hat and swimming goggles and earplugs. And that was the way that he could protect himself from any kind of contact in the world. So it was so brave of him, still makes me emotional, actually, thinking about him. So brave of him to come and meet with me. And initially, it was hard for him to share his narrative, to share his story. He had moved across Canada to major cities, hoping to escape his past. But of course, it kept following him. So he said, this time, I want to do this. I want to do this. And so the initial way that I got to know him and his story was through editorials. He would write to the newspaper and then exchange write to himself. And that was the way that he began to encounter his own vulnerability, to risk revealing himself to another. And then we looked at themes, and there were themes of anger and danger and relationships. And over time, he took off his goggles and began to make eye contact, but just a little bit at a time. I kind of squinted his eye and just looked out of the corner of his eye. Eventually, he took out his earplugs, and eventually he started to ride the bus without the goggles and one earplug. And eventually he joined a club. And then eventually he actually got a volunteer job at a cafeteria. So,
Wow.
so it's I think a poignant example of how when we are shut off from ourselves and others, he talked, one of the most poignant thing that will for sure make me emotional is that when we started out, he said that he would cover his mirror with a towel, that he didn't want to see himself, and and that his room felt like a coffin. His apartment felt like a coffin. He felt dead. But as he began to encounter his vulnerability, he started to live. This is what vulnerability is all about, allowing us to live fully and completely and to find ourselves and grow ourselves in the relationships that matter most. And of course, that's not the therapeutic context, but in some cases, that's where it starts. In other cases, it starts with dating in adolescence or in young adulthood or at some other time in our lives when we can find a safe other to turn to and to grow with.
Wow. That took some real courage on your part too, Leanne. As a graduate student to work in on a case that's so intense right at the beginning of your career, and because it seems to me that someone's going to be like that when there's some serious emotions going on underneath and some real serious fears. But you also make me think of the old phrase, fear is not the absence, or courage is not the absence of fear. You know that?
Yes.
I kind of want to replace vulnerability here. Courage is, is not the absence of vulnerability. It's courage seems to be a big part of what's going on with vulnerability. You made that clear when you said that was really brave of him to come all that way while feeling so frightened.
Yeah.
I'm curious a little bit. I hope you don't mind my asking, but I'm curious a little bit about your own vulnerability journey.
My own vulnerability journey.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, it's a good question. I think well, I don't even know where to start. What are you curious about?
Well, we can start in grad school. Here you
yes,
are.
okay, yeah.
You're learning about these things. You've obviously been a successful student. You've got a lot going for you. And you're now in a situation where you're working with a rising superstar, and because she's right out of grad school at that point.
Yes. Yeah.
Can't believe it.
Yes. Yeah.
Right at that same time, I was just starting to work with Gottman.
Right.
And so you're having to learn a lot about how to be a clinician, which is no easy feat. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering what kinds of challenges you remember learning to put yourself at risk in that role.
Yeah. Well, again, it's all about safety. And I had the good fortune of being in a cohort that many of the professors described as a good wine, that this was the right year. So we really were so lucky to be among an amazing group of peers. And at the time, a really incredible set of faculty, Sue being one of them, of course, and then others who had worked with Pearls and with Chandler and, all of these amazing opportunities. And for sure, it was terrifying. When I first met this man, I would take my tapes into a room full of other graduate students and the professor and, risk being vulnerable, risk revealing myself as a new therapist. But it was amazing. And it was the best learning. And it's another great, I think, illustration of how we can grow when we allow ourselves to be vulnerable, because then we can learn, we can listen, and grow ourselves. So for me, it was amazing. And I learned so much from that client, but from so many, after meeting him, I just thought, I just want to work with trauma and loss and grief. And this is a world that helps me to understand development and what happens when development goes well and when it doesn't go so well. And I really can feel like I can make a difference. So that's what I've focused on for the last 30 years.
Yeah, it's a great story. It's a great story. And I love how you highlight that part of what gave you the strength, and it's funny, it's always so poetic because we start out the conversation agreeing that many people equate vulnerability with weakness. But what gave you the strength to be vulnerable, to be courageous with your potential for failure, bad decisions, goofy mistakes, whatever it was partly derived from your incredible cohort of people who were there to be vulnerable with you and to be supportive of you. So many things I've learned. I've got lots to learn still about all of this stuff, and I've learned that responding to vulnerability isn't some kind of recipe. It's really joining in with being vulnerable. That vulnerability is about being brave. That vulnerability is about being authentic and about respecting yourself and having love and care for yourself. I feel like I have an expanded view of vulnerability and its role in our relationships. And I'm really, really grateful to you.
Jim, I'm grateful to you. Thank you for having me on your show and all that you've contributed to this amazing field.
Well, I try. One of these days, I might get to be interviewed by you.
That would be fantastic.
Yeah.
Love it. Great.
Okay.
Super.
Thanks so much again.
Thanks for listening to Our Love podcast. We hope you enjoyed today's topic. Please be sure to click subscribe to get future episodes and give us a 5-star rating to help others find us. We'll see you again next week, and we hope that you are experiencing your best love today.